About a week ago on this channel, I covered a tabletop RPG called Draconim, this sort of high-powered, very high fantasy game that featured a personal dragon companion for every PC and some really in-depth solo play development. But one thing I didn't touch on was how the creator crossed paths is making this game function as a case study in comprehensive product development for the current RPG market. Since that last video, I'm finding the most interesting thing about Draconim may be how the creators are able to build an infrastructure of player and GM friendly tools around their game. This is not really great news for very small indie RPG developers who want to write an awesome game and then put it out into the world, because it's no longer sufficient to just write some rules, slap some art onto it, and hope for adoption. The most successful indie and third-party games coming out now are supported by digital ecosystems, comprehensive onboarding tools, and community features that address real barriers to play. And that raises a practical question for anyone watching the RPG industry. What does it actually take to get a new system into regular rotation at gaming tables? In this video, I did want to actually cover some of Draconim's mechanics a bit more, mostly because I want to ensure you that this is a game worth actually playing. But I also wanted to highlight some of the consumer-friendly pro player, pro GM support stuff being done outside of the game. So here's my roadmap for this video. Feel free to jump around with the timestamps. Alright, so first there's the online character creation tool, which I think a lot of people expect first and foremost in a game that has any kind of online support at all, considering that this has been the most important function of D&D Beyond if you're a 5e player. In the case of Draconim's character builder, well, the game is much more streamlined than 5e, so the process is faster and easier. You start by typing in your name and then assigning your attributes with a drag and drop interface. Since by default this game wants you to use a standard array, then you're not really manually changing any of these numbers. Instead, at character creation, you can just add 1 point to any of the 6 core stats, and you do that by clicking on the stat below. Next, you choose your kin. I covered this in my last video about Draconim, but yeah, this setting has 12 playable kin, and if you're a frequent watcher of this channel, you'll know that I'm more of a 1 to 3 playable races kind of guy. So if I were running Draconim, I'd want to sit down with my players and talk about how to pare down this list a little bit and maybe tweak a few things about the setting. And on that note, let's play a giant ferret. By the way, all of these kin come with several cultural features and 3 so-called subkin, or subtypes that have unique features all their own. Next, we'll choose our class. I know it may seem kind of limiting to have just 4 classes, but this game actually features 20 different paths that combine with any of these classes, so there are really about 80 path combinations. At the time of recording, the paths are not yet available in the online character generator, but that's because I'm using a pre-release version of the web tool. There are 8 backgrounds to choose from as well, and these are in addition to the classes and paths, and they provide their own sets of abilities that you unlock as you level up. Then as far as starting gear, there's some guidance here on the right. I think they'll be adding clickable options in the center column by the time the site is published. Probably the most important function of this site is the export tool, which spits out a form fillable version of your character sheet. The form fillable part is extremely important because it means that you can further edit your character digitally without having to print out the page and basically stay paper free if that's something you want to do. Let's run through the anatomy of an enemy stat block in this game. It's a good way to illustrate what the GM is working with when prepping a session. I'm going to pick a tier 1 adversary from the back of the Herald's Guide, which is this game's 220-page GM guide. This book actually has a lot of interesting guidance on how to build an encounter, the most important bit being the discussion of different roles for different enemies. Here we have a deep fairy. Threat rating is 1, which means it's a fair match against 1 level 1 hero. The threat rating should be the total number of levels that a party of PCs have. So if this were a single TR3 enemy, then it would be a fair match for a party of 3 level 1 PCs. Or if it were a single TR12 enemy, it would be a fair match for a party of 4 level 3 PCs because their total PC levels would add up to 12. The flavor text here says that deep fairies are strange, graceful, and patient. They do not speak, born into the stars, withering in silence. Hit points are hit points in the traditional sense. Although the game uses wound thresholds to track PC health in combat, enemies actually just track a linear HP value. If you had to translate between the two, it would be 3 HP equals 1 light wound and 9 HP equals 1 heavy wound. Armor slots tell you how much potential damage reduction the enemy has. Then there are movement rates per turn, expressed in grid squares of 6 feet per square. Resistances reduce incoming damage of that type by half, and immunities reduce that kind of damage to 0. Here's my favorite part of the enemy stat block in this game right here. Sights, sounds, smells, wants, fears, instincts, and triggers. These are all elements of a creature that actually make it interesting. I don't really think you have to follow this language to the letter as the GM, but just having to think about these elements and fill in your own details for any of these categories is enough to make an encounter way more interesting. Then most importantly for the actual combat is the D12 action table that each enemy has, which provides on average 5 different unique actions or abilities that the creature will initiate on their turn. Finally, there's a unique reaction that each enemy has. In this case, anytime the fairy is hit with a melee attack, it moves 3 squares and gains a bless on the next roll, which is a pretty elegant way of mixing things up and making this a very slippery creature to defeat, at least with melee attacks. There are currently 31 enemy stat blocks at the end of the Herald's Guide, all of them pretty uniformly formatted, but extremely varied in design. There will be apparently a ton more monsters in the final book, all distributed evenly across challenge levels. I just find the stat approach to be very aggressive in trying to make sure that you're not just trading blows until one side runs out of HP or picks up too many wounds. The game really wants the GM to stay creative with combat encounters. I wanted to touch briefly on the hex crawl rules found in the solo rulebook for Draconim because I think they're very likely to show up again and again in any solo campaign. Anytime you're entering a new hex on the map, you'll make a travel check, and that will be either with your world and soul attributes or your world and shadow attributes if you're trying to be sneaky. On a success, you proceed without issue. On a failure, you mark a segment on your resource clock. This clock tracks your general fatigue and travel resources abstractly, and when it reaches 6, you take a light scar and suffer a penalty on all rolls until your next downtime. And if your travel check yields a complication, which is anytime your dice pool produces 2 or more 1s, then you roll on the insight table. That looks like this, where you first roll a d12 to determine the subtable, then 3d6 to generate 3 words that you sort of interpret into an event. So if I reached a new hex and my travel check generated a complication and my insight table roll came up 3 on the d12 and my d6 rolls came up 1, 4, and 5, then I'd have open sky and broken promise. How would you interpret these 3 words as your travel complication for the day? It could be something like the weather turning unexpectedly harsh despite promising to be a clear day, or maybe an open sky landmark that someone promised you would be reachable proves to be inaccessible. You don't actually have to use the game's hex map at all, but it's a part of a setting that is there in case you want it. In the case of this game's map, there are ultimately 2 kinds of hexes, marked and unmarked. If it's marked, that means it's named, charted, and detailed at the end of the solo rulebook. If you enter Hex 603, for example, you'd look that up and find Shrine of the Oathkeeper. And like all marked hex locations, there's a day and night event table. You can take up to 2 events from these tables, and those 2 will be your 2 daytime events for the day. And you'll also want to take note of all the features listed for this location and sort of pick and choose how your PC will interact with the area. One really nice feature of the 22 named locations at the end of the solo guidebook is the fact that most of them fit on just 2 pages, so there doesn't have to be much flipping back and forth. I think it's worth noting that the game's rules and text in their entirety are available in a virtual tabletop to anyone who backs Draconim at the crowdfund stage of the game. More often than not, you'll see publishers sell a game in print, PDF, and VTT separately, but here it looks like Crossed Paths is just throwing in the VTT version of the game as a bonus to backers. One resource that I think is pretty important for a game with as wide and ambitious a setting as this one is a relatively short primer for players. A guide to Batesian is just that, running 28 pages and giving players a brief rundown of the setting of Akaroth. Just in case you're wondering, Batesian refers to a particular realm in the setting, one of 11 distinct regions that features a more traditional Western fantasy look and feel. Like I mentioned earlier, this game is high-powered and high fantasy by default. Batesian alone demonstrates that, but I'm curious to see if the other regions could serve as a platform for playing the game in a different tone or fashion. At any rate, this region is quite diverse. One of the things that I've advocated for a while now and was really impressed to see with Draconim is a planned series of tutorial videos. Videos like how to create a character, for example, are just part and parcel of a modern tabletop RPG rollout. I know there are arguments against making tutorial videos for your tabletop RPGs, but you'll never convince me that this is not a best practice. The reality is this is a deeply asymmetrical hobby, with GMs having to buy all the books and do all the reading, while players belly up to the table having done little or no reading in a lot of cases. That sucks for those GMs out there, but it also detracts from the player experience. One way around that is to provide short, easy to watch videos that teach the game. And these videos have the added benefit of bringing in more players who, let's hope, will eventually buy a copy of the game to support the creator. So one of the more evocative online tools that Crossed Paths is making for their game is the spell card creator. I'm not sure if you watched my video detailing how the creators of Daggerheart have made this very same kind of tool, but I was impressed then and I'm even more impressed now because the team behind Draconim is much smaller than that of Darrington Press, and yet here we are with an intuitive, robust online spell card creation tool that even features 720 pieces of art from the game. Once you've forged your custom spell card, you can click export to PNG and have your card for a VTT or to print out on paper or cardstock. I'm not sure how common it's going to be to have custom card creators for RPGs, but I'm all for it. Or maybe companies like Darrington Press and Crossed Paths are just setting the bar too high and we'll never see awesome tools like this for other games. I guess time will tell. Okay, here's another online resource that Draconim features, the Codex, which is essentially a sort of standard reference document that features all of the backgrounds for PCs, the 4 classes, the 12 kin, all of which we saw earlier in the online character creator. It's all recapitulated here for reference. And here are the paths. I imagine this will be further developed to include path abilities for reference. And finally, the 80 or so spells in the core game, all searchable as well. It should be noted that the character creator, spell creator, and codex are all going to be available publicly to everyone, not just backers of the crowdfund campaign. The thing is, all these free reference tools, tutorial videos, and onboarding materials that Crossed Paths has built around Draconim aren't just consumer-friendly practices. They're addressing real adoption barriers that have kept other solid RPGs from reaching broader gaming tables. Whether Draconim will achieve the kind of sustained table presence that its creators need remains to be seen, but this level of investment in player and GM support gives it a better shot than most games at breaking out of the initial crowdfunding enthusiasm bubble. At a minimum, they're demonstrating what comprehensive game support should look like and potentially raising expectations for what players should expect from RPG publishers. Draconim is crowdfunding at the time of recording, and I'll leave links below to the campaign where you can learn more and back the game if it's something you believe in. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on whether this kind of extensive digital ecosystem is becoming necessary for RPG success. Let me know down in the comments. Thanks for watching. I'll see you.